Get it going. All right. So what's up, everybody? I wanted to give us a great, simple breakdown of JavaScript and getting started with that. So over the last couple of sessions, we've been talking a lot about, HTML, CSS, and the fundamentals of front-end development. And no conversation about the web, front end, et cetera, can be complete without introducing JavaScript. And so over the next couple of sessions and videos, I'll be describing a lot more about how we utilize JavaScript in the process of building out our websites. But today I want to just kind of, look at it with a finer tooth comb and just kind of get a better sense of an understanding of like what goes into JavaScript and writing JavaScript code as a programming language. So this will be a great introductory to the programming language of JavaScript. So if you haven't ever written any JavaScript code, this will probably be a great place to start. And we'll use it as a springboard into some other conversations as we get progressively more deep into some of the more advanced, I want to say, but we utilize JavaScript in a number of different ways when we write and build websites nowadays. And so it can range from JavaScript in very simple forms for simple websites to more complex uses of the same kinds of concepts you'll see that we'll be talking about, but extended to do some more interesting things and perform differently when it comes to more advanced websites. So hopefully you're going to enjoy learning a little bit more about JavaScript. And with that, let's just dive into it. So I want to set the tone of how we work with JavaScript, but to do so, I want to start with what we know so far, just kind of talking about simple web-based things, right? And I do that for a reason, just so that we have a place so that we can write some JavaScript code. But once I get to that point, we'll start and transfer over and talk a little bit more about JavaScript itself as a particular programming language. But first, I want to just set myself up with a new web-based site to work off. So I'm just going to go through those quick fundamentals that we've been talking about and create a new little project for me to work on as I do some stuff to practice this JavaScript out. So what I'm going to do is create a new folder in my computer. I'm going to call it I'm just going to call it HTML CSS/JS. It's going to be a little folder for me to kind of just continue to work off of, build some other projects and things like that. So with this ready, I'm going to open this folder in VS Code, and we will build out just a nice little interface for us to start working with the JavaScript in a simple enough way. So VS Code just opened up for me. VS Code is a text editor for those of y'all that aren't familiar with it. This text editor allows me to write a number of different programming languages, which we'll see in a second is going to be really helpful for once we start the process of working with JavaScript. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to quickly create a couple, and quickly tell VS Code to trust me. Trust me, I know what I'm doing here. But after that, I'm actually going to create a couple of files to work off. Today, I'm going to keep it real simple. So I'm just going to write one HTML file. So this is going to just be an index.html file. And in this file, I'm going to just create a default HTML document. So for everybody that's interested in building websites, HTML is the starting point for all of our websites, right? We use HTML to define the structure of our website in terms of the elements that will be present on the website. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a standard HTML document. And so to do this, I'm going to just kind of put the basics of HTML that we've talked about so far into the document. And just give me 1 second. Computer froze for a second. Cool. So the basics that we know so far, right? There's a couple of different elements that we've been talking a lot about. The HTML element will give us a document to work off of. The head will be where we put document metadata and things about our website when we finalize it. and the body will be where we put some visual elements. So for now, I have this standard HTML document for myself, right? And with these 5 lines of code saved to an index.html file, you will also have like a standard HTML file to work on, which is great. Cool. So I'm just going to save this and use this in demonstrating a little bit of the JavaScript that we're going to be getting into today. And you might be wondering, well, why do we need an HTML file to start talking about JavaScript, right? And the reason why is because JavaScript is an interesting programming language in that JavaScript typically is run on the web in terms of it runs typically in parallel with the HTML and CSS that we might write for a website. So one of the ways to get started with JavaScript is to add it to a website, right? And so without having to focus so much on the HTML, we can leverage this document to give us a space to more particularly work with JavaScript and learn kind of the ins and outs of JavaScript in a simpler fashion. Now, you might have heard of other places where JavaScript is used, right? Like in, oh, well, what about Node and Node environments, right? And those environments, Node was created because JavaScript typically runs in the web on HTML-like websites, right? So when you want to build more intermediate and more kind of advanced JavaScript applications, we have to actually use a different tool to run the JavaScript. So we'll talk all about this from start to finish, but for now, we're going to just use this basic HTML document to just demonstrate the kind of concept of JavaScript in a way that we'll be able to see on our browser. So to do this, right, we made this simple HTML document. And as a recap for anybody that's not familiar with HTML, HTML is a document. We create different elements that have specific tags that reference what those elements do. So in this case, this document is just a blank HTML document. There's nothing really outside of the HTML tag, which is kind of the overarching tag that describes the document. There's 2 tags that come inside of the HTML tag. The head and the body. The head is typically where we save metadata information about our site, and we also create connections to other files and resources. So we'll actually do some work with the head in a second. And then the body is where, when you're actually building out an HTML site, you spend time building out and writing out those elements that you want your users to see. And we have a bunch of different videos about that, so we'll make sure that get those references over to anybody that's interested. But for now, we're just going to use this basic HTML document to get to talk a little bit more about JavaScript. And in the next few videos and sessions, we'll dive a little bit more deeply into how we extend what we now have done with JavaScript on this document in order to build out more progressive web-based applications. So with this document, right, it's going to be important for us to actually see it, right, and to kind of work off of this HTML document and to just know that things are working. So one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a new browser window, and we're going to use that browser window to just take a look at this HTML on the browser. So what I'm going to do is in this browser window, just for now, I'm going to go ahead and open that file that we just created. So that HTML file that y'all just saw, I want to open it in the browser. And by doing that, we should see, right now we see a kind of empty page. There's nothing really in. So to make this a little bit nicer just for myself, I'm just going to add some elements into the body just so we see something and say, hey, check, say like, hey, welcome back. And then I'm going to add one more element, a paragraph element, and just say, check the console. We're using JavaScript. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a second. But for now, I'm just going to save this and just reload this page. And clearly now we actually are seeing something on the page because we opened this file up in the browser, and because it's an HTML file and because we're declaring some elements, we're actually seeing some visual elements. Today, we won't focus so much on the HTML side, but as you can see from this paragraph, we're going to be working with JavaScript. And so JavaScript is an accompaniment to HTML and CSS, right? And so to kind of pause real quick on what we're seeing here, just to show you all my lovely face as I say this, JavaScript is a programming language, right? And so like any other programming language that you might have heard of, Java, Python, right? Swift, right? All programming languages are giving us the ability to write out and encode commands that our computer will be able to run when it gets processed, right? And every programming language has different ways of having that text, that language that we're writing get processed, right? Some have compilers, some have interpreters, but the idea is that when we write these lines of code, right, we're essentially trying to get the machine to do things on our behalf based on what we're writing, right? And the value of a programming language, no matter what programming language you're choosing, is that you can leverage that programming language to have the machine act in specific ways based on what you want. JavaScript is no different, right, than any of those other programming languages in that regard. But every programming language has differences in terms of how it is written and how it's structured. We call the ways that a programming language is written and structured, it's syntax. Yes, I wish I had like big vocab moments, like syntax. So the syntax is how a programming language is written and how you have to format a programming language to have it do what you want it to do, right? So every programming language has a different syntax, but programming languages as a goal all do the same thing, which is allow for you to write in ways that will turn into instructions for a machine. If that makes sense to you, give me a quick thumbs up. That's like me defining computer science to a 4-year-old. I appreciate it. So today we're going to talk all about JavaScript, the programming language of JavaScript. And in doing so, we'll talk about some of the key concepts that come up in other programming languages, but we'll focus today mostly on the syntax of JavaScript so you can understand how you can get started writing some JavaScript code for yourself. So with that being said, let's get back to what we're talking about here. So we have this beautiful HTML site that is going to be the basis for where we'll start writing our JavaScript. And the reason why is because, like I mentioned, JavaScript is typically written to be included in web-based experiences like this website, for instance, right? We know this is the case because JavaScript is being processed through our web browser, right? Our browsers allow for us to run and work with JavaScript. And sometimes when something's broken on a site, right, it'll tell you, hey, you know, like this site's not working because something's wrong with the JavaScript or something of that nature, right? You might have seen that in your own experience. One of the things that we're going to get really familiar with as we continue to work with JavaScript and as you continue your journey into web dev is the inspector and the developer tools that come built into most browsers, right? Google Chrome, I use Brave, Firefox, Safari. I'm pretty sure Internet Explorer, but I haven't used Internet Explorer in so long, I don't know. But most of these browsers all have developer tools built into them. Those developer tools give you the tools that you need in order to look at the source code of a website. So we could see the HTML source of a particular website. So this is me inspecting looking at the source code for that HTML. But the developer tools also allow for us to open up a series of tools that are going to be helpful for you in your web dev journey, right? Of course, one of those tools is the elements inspector. So you could theoretically, as you're building your sites, take a look at each element one by one and look at things like the styling, et cetera. So for all the HTML, CSS nerds here and the folks that have learned with us on this journey, that's what the elements tab is for. Today and going forward, we're going to be working a lot more in the console tab. And the console tab is effectively the JavaScript console, where we actually can work with and get back input and output from JavaScript that we're going to be working on and writing. And so we're gonna just go ahead and just add some JavaScript. I know they're all like, can you get to the JavaScript? We're gonna get to the point, get us some JavaScript onto this document and seeing it within our console. So to do that, we're gonna go back to VS Code and we're gonna write this JavaScript. So the logical question is, okay, well, where are we gonna write this JavaScript so that we're going to be able to we can do this in this HTML document. We can either put JavaScript inside of the head or inside of the body. And so I'll talk about both and show you kind of how we'll do it and the pros and cons. But for the sake of it, right, there is a particular tag that you're going to use whenever you're working with JavaScript in your websites. That tag is the script tag. It looks just like this, script tag, right? And like I told y'all, one of the cool things about using a text editor like VS Code is that if you hover over it, it'll give you some more information about the different elements that you're working on and writing. So here you can see it says the script element allows authors to include dynamic script and data blocks into their documents. This element does not represent content for the user, right? Well, when you read that, this element does not display content for the user, right? That is what we talked about before about the head, right? You know, in the head, we don't really show content for the user. So that's one of the reasons why people typically will put some JavaScript in the head, because it won't translate into anything visual for the user. But at the same time, we can write it in elements that can be embedded in our HTML, just like so. So what we're gonna do is we're going to, in this script, write out our first little bit of JavaScript. And that little bit of JavaScript is just going to be a very simple hello world line of code. So on line 8 here, I just wrote in between these two script tags, a console.log with inside of parentheses, a string for hello world, right? So I'm going to save this. I'm going to go ahead, refresh this browser tab, and as y'all saw, I went and opened up the developer tool. So if you go to the developer tools, you can go either just right click and just click inspect or view elements, or you can go to view and developer, and some browsers have a developer tab, and just look for the JavaScript console. And inside of that console now, if we go back to our handy dandy console, you can see that that hello world has logged to the console. Effectively why we call it console.log, right? Because we're logging things directly to that console, the JavaScript console that's built into our browser. If you see what I'm talking about, just give me a thumbs up, just so I know that y'all see what I'm saying, right? The console that we just pulled up on the tools is the same console that we're referencing in our HTML file in that line. So I'll go back to the code real quick. So we use this HTML document because we need this script tag in order to write the JavaScript, right? And so, as I just mentioned, we put the script tag here. The script tag you can see is on lines from 7, 8, and 9. And inside on line 8, we wrote the console.log, which allowed for us to get that output to the console. And that's great. That's our first bit of JavaScript. So if you got that far, pat yourself on the back. You're writing some JavaScript. You're doing it, right? One other thing worth mentioning is that this script tag can also be inside of the head. So I'll just go ahead and just move it up here into the head. And then again, just refresh. And as you can see, we're still getting that console log back into the console. So you can either write your script tags in the head or in the body, right? JavaScript can be placed either in the head or in the body of an HTML document. So that's the point number 1 when we start thinking about how we're going to write this JavaScript. So let's talk a little bit more about JavaScript now that we kind of got our first line written in here, right? This hello world. And so JavaScript is a programming language that is utilized in probably every website that you've ever been to, because it is a dynamic programming language, but it ties very well into HTML and CSS, and we'll see why in a couple other sessions. But JavaScript itself is a programming language. So like other programming language, like other programming languages, you can use JavaScript to do a number of really important things that will allow for you to create those commands that you're going to run and talk to, send to your computer and to effectively to your websites to handle for you, right? So what we're seeing on line 5 is our first example of running a function in JavaScript. So what we're seeing here is us running a function. I'm just going to turn this into a quick little comment for myself here, right? Running a function. This is us running this JavaScript function console.log, right? But before we get deeper into functions, let's take this to the beginning and just kind of talk a little bit more about some of the basics of JavaScript. I'm just going to enter a couple times to just give myself a little bit more space. Again, I want to do this to remind you, like, hey, you know, I know we're in this HTML document and that's important, but right now we're focusing in on inside of this script tag. So everything inside of this environment right now, inside of the script tag, is where we can write our JavaScript. So inside of these script tags, I'm going to introduce a couple more fundamental concepts of JavaScript, right? The first one that is really important to talk about is variables and data types, right? So every programming language has a number of different ways for us to work on creating variables and working with data. In JavaScript, there's 3 ways that we can create variables. There's a keyword called let, a keyword called var, and a keyword called const. Admittedly, the keyword that you're going to be using the most is probably the let keyword, but we can talk about all 3 of these. Basically, the first keyword for creating variables that was created in JavaScript was the var keyword. So with the var keyword, we could do certain things like create a new variable, like a name, and set it equal to some data, right? In this case, I'll set it equal to my name, right? And say Cam, right? So in this case, in this line, right, what I'm saying here is I want to create a variable called name. That variable is essentially a piece of data that has a identifier called name. And I'm going to set it equal. So this is me saying I'm setting this data, I'm setting this variable to be what this data on the right side of the equal sign is, which in this case is my name, Cam. My name and things that typically represent other characters of letters, we call strings, right? So this is me setting my name to this variable called name to be a string with my name, Cam. The var keyword was the de facto way for us to create variables in JavaScript. But it has since been replaced in terms of modern practice with the let keyword, where the let keyword is typically now how the let keyword, excuse me, I should have put this as a comment. So it's not tweaking on us. The let keyword is how nowadays we kind of define the same thing, creating a new variable. So you'll see people use the let keyword to define a new variable, and that variable will be given some name, no pun intended, and that variable name will be receiving some data of some data type. The difference between a let and a var and the const keyword, right? So if I had a different variable called, let's say ID or something, right? The difference between these different variable keywords, the let and the const keyword, is that const is a variable keyword that we use when we want to define a piece of data that shouldn't be changed. So by declaring something with a const, we're saying, hey, I don't want that data to be changed at any point in time. The let keyword will be able to be changed later, just like the var keyword used to be as well. So you'll see in different documents, if you're looking at old school JavaScript, that people are using the var keyword. Nowadays, most folks are using let keyword. And if in circumstances where they're like, hey, I want to define some data that won't be changed, I'm going to use the const keyword. So these days, you'll probably see these two most often in your code. But hopefully now you get the difference between the three of these. Let and var do pretty similar things. The const keyword is the one that's pretty different in terms of it won't allow for data to be changed. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the types of data that we can actually save and use in JavaScript. So clearly, when we're working with letters and characters, we have strings, right? And strings in JavaScript are declared. You can either declare them with quotation marks, like double quotation marks like this, or you can declare them with single quotation marks like this. There's multiple ways to define strings. And we'll talk a little bit more about some other ways to define strings when we get a little bit more familiar with the JavaScript. On line 10 in this constant, I actually declared this to be a number, right? So in JavaScript, there's different types of numbers that we can assign to a particular variable. So in this case, this pretty large number that has no decimal points would be an integer. We could also add some decimal points and make it a floating point or a double in terms of its ability to hold a decimal. But we can use strings, we can represent numbers, Boolean values, so true and false values. So I could say something like let is teacher, and then set that to true, right? One of the things you might notice that is a big difference between JavaScript and Java for folks who are used to more like languages like Java is that you don't have to use semicolons. So the use of semicolons in JavaScript is not required. You can use them, but it doesn't do anything for you, much like, unlike how in Java, in certain cases, if you don't have a semicolon, you'll get some errors, right? So that's just important to know that's just important to know about how the JavaScript works. So strings, numbers, Boolean values, these, and there's other fundamental data types that we use to work with data within JavaScript. But I would say for the sake of right now, the most important ones as a fundamental to get started, we got some strings, we have some numbers, we have some Boolean values, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other ones that come up. If you can drop your questions in the chat, fam, that would be more helpful to me, just because I want to continue to run through this so that we can get to some stuff by the end. Appreciate it. So clearly I have these values, right? And so I'll just get back into just demonstrating this a little bit for y'all on the browser. So what I want to do now is, now that I've written out a couple of different values in these variables, I'm going to go back and use that console log function in order to output them. And so just to kind of recap, right? We created this HTML file, and we used the HTML element script, the script tag, in order to write this JavaScript out, right? Anything inside, in between two script tags, is going to be able to be processed as JavaScript on in our websites. To see the output of that JavaScript, we can open up the developer tools for the console and get into the JavaScript console, and we'll be able to see the output of those all these lines of JavaScript there. So here, anything that I want to output to the JavaScript console, I use this console.log function and pass in some data for it to process. So I'm gonna save this, just go back and refresh, and clearly you can see Cam is now being logged to the console because of that line 12 where we're console logging the name. So with JavaScript, we clearly can save things like strings, we can save things like numbers, and we can save things like Boolean values, so true and false like values. And we're using another important concept of JavaScript right here in order to manipulate that data. And those are functions, right? And so functions are a piece of the puzzle when it comes to building code, is being able to manipulate and pass around data from place to place, right? And we use functions to do both of those things. A function is essentially a piece of code that contains within its scope instructions for basically instructions for the program to run whenever that particular function gets called. So console.log is a function that was defined already by it's an internal JavaScript function. So somewhere there's a declaration of what the console.log function does. But what a function allows us to do is call it in order for us to manipulate the data in that particular way. Just answer some questions in the chat. So let's take a look at a function that we might create for ourselves outside of the console.log in order to understand a little bit more about how functions work in JavaScript. So if I want to write a function in JavaScript, so let's say I want to write a new function and I'll have it be something like greet, like say like, hey, you know, this function will say hello whenever, this function will say hello to whoever is coming onto our website, right? So in order to declare a new function, there's a couple of ways to do it. So the first way is to use the function keyword in order to declare a new function. A function, just like variables, has a particular identifier that we can use to call that function. And so in this case, I'm saying, hey, I want to create a new function called greet. And greet is going to, inside of these curly braces, we're going to define what happens when greet gets called, right? So every function in between the curly braces is where we define how that function works, right? And so in this case, what I might want to do is actually take my console log and just push it into this function. And so functions are a very important aspect of all programming languages, but in JavaScript, we're using this particular function to say, hey, whenever someone calls our greet function, we'll just console log something to them, right? So instead of kind of doing this console log hello world and whatnot, I'm gonna actually just kind of kill two birds with one stone here. And I'm just gonna say hello and put the name like so. So what I'm doing here is console.log is also a function. It takes in some values that it will then put onto the into the console for us, into JavaScript console. The value of the console log is so that we can actually get the output shown in the console in the inspector for us. So now, whenever I call greet, I might want to make it so that greet can be a little bit more unique, right? So right now, right, if I were to call the greet function, which I can do just like so, right? Calling a function is as simple as taking the name of that function you defined and calling it with parentheses. By doing this, right, I'm going to run this now in the browser and take a look at our output, and it says hello can, right? There's a couple of little small things we got to tweak about this to make it work better, right? And the first thing is, well, there's no space between hello and can, but you can see that we were able to pass one string with the plus and then another pass our variable that we defined above here, right? So with JavaScript, much like all other programming languages, there are also operators that you can use to do things like adding two strings together or adding numbers together, right? So, and you can assume, right, that, okay, the plus sign will help me add these two things. The minus sign will, and multiplication sign are also operators that we can use in different ways as well. But for the sake of printing this statement better, what I want to do is just add a little space here so that, okay, it says hello with a space, and then it should say my name. So doing that should fix the output a little bit. And maybe I want to move that, move this exclamation mark to be at the end. So I'll just add another line and I'll put a space there. So it'll say hello space cam with the exclamation mark. So saving, refreshing, and then going here, cool. I can clearly see that my JavaScript is running, and that's all good. But of course, like, you know, it's not, I don't want it to just say my name each time. Well, it would be great if, you know, if when somebody else comes to the site, right, we can greet them the way that they want to be greeted, right? And so we can pass data into a function in order to make it so that we can pass data into a function in order to make it so that we can make this function work more uniquely with the data that we give, right? And so if, for instance, let's say we have a couple other folks that are going to come to this site. So let's say let person one, and let's just say Simon, let's say person two, and we'll say Tabitha. I'm coming up with some random names right now. It's crazy. And let's say person three is Trey, right? So if these three people come to the site, I might want the greet function to work unique to them, right? So instead of just saying, hey, console log my name, I might want to console log whoever that person's name is, right? So in doing that, it would be great if I could, instead of having to copy this function 3 times, I could just say, hey, I'm going to pass in some values that's going to be a name, and we can greet people with our function and pass the name in there. To do that, I'm just going to want to make sure I comment this out, because one thing that will come up in all programming languages is errors related to things like, hey, you already have a variable name here, and then you're creating and using one here, right? Those types of errors will make your program not run correctly. So JavaScript, like other programming languages though, does do a good job of helping us with error messages when you look at the console. So that's one of the reasons why looking at JavaScript in the console is helpful. But we don't want errors. So I'm just gonna go ahead and comment this name out. And we can run our greet function by now passing in the data for each person. So we can say greet person one, greet person two, and greet person three, right? And now saving this, I will expect that no errors have been made, and we can clearly see that our code is working, where we can extend our function to talk to all 3 of these people. So functions, we can pass data into a function in order to make those functions work a little bit more uniquely, right? Earlier, I was talking a little bit about some of the operators, right? So we're using clearly the + operator here for creating, adding a string to a string. We can also do a similar thing with numbers, right? So I'm going to create a different function here, and I'm just going to say, I want to show us creating a different function that will maybe allow for us to add some values, right? So with JavaScript, like I mentioned, there's a couple different ways we can write functions. So one way is like this with the function keyword, like you see here. The second way is using a different syntax for creating functions, which we'll get to in a second. Somebody just asked in the chat, can you please repeat why we use the greet word here, right? And so remember, with any function that we create, right, the idea is a function will be defined. We define the function and we tell it what to do, right? To define the function, it has two more important things. The keyword that says that, hey, this is going to be a function, and it has the name of the function that we're actually going to call to do the work of the function. So in this case, greet is a function that we defined here from lines 17 to 21. But when I want to actually call the function, right? So just writing this, if I were to just write this and take these away, right? Just writing this is just me defining the function. So there's no output because the function itself was never actually run. It was never called. What we were doing was defining it, but what we really want to do is say, hey, I actually want to run this function. I want people to be greeted, right? And so to run the function, I need to call that function with its name and then pass in the data that it might be expecting. So in this case, this function called greet is expecting that I'm going to pass some data called name. In this case, this is a great opportunity to say that this piece of data is just a generic name. This piece of data is just a generic way to reference whatever was passed in the function. So because it doesn't matter that here I called it name, but here it's, you see it says person one. What this is assuming though is that person one, right, is going to be data that I want to eventually log like so. And so essentially what would happen is person one, right, this is a piece of data called Simon, right? So when I say greet person one, because this is a variable, I'm basically saying greet Simon, right? So this function is taking that data and saying, okay, call the greet function with this piece of data. Well, this piece of data is referenced here as name, right? So essentially we can replace whatever we see in the function from 17 to 21 where it says name with that piece of data. So we're essentially saying greet Simon, right? And we just saw before how when we use the console.log with a string, we're able to get that string sent to the console with the console.log, right? And so by doing that, now I actually am able to call the function and have it run and be output the data to the console. So with functions, there's two key steps. The first step is declaring the function and like saying, hey, this is what this function is going to do. The second step is calling the function. So that's why we do that. And there's multiple ways for us to call functions and declare functions. And so we've seen how it works with the function keyword. But let's say I want to create a new function. Let's say I want to create a new function for adding two numbers, right? So with this, right, in order to do this, I could very well do what we just did before, which is say, okay, function, give it a name, let's say something like add, and I want to pass in two numbers, maybe X and Y, right? Give it some curly braces because these curly braces are where the function will actually be, where we kind of define what the function is going to do. So do stuff here, right? And what I want to do is I want to just essentially return the value of X plus Y, right? So here you can see functions also in JavaScript can return values as well. So if I want this function to, sorry y'all for that inconvenience. If I want to get the value of like, hey, if I pass you two numbers, give me back the value of them, right? Well, I can use the return keyword to say, hey, give me back that data that is being added essentially, right? So let's test this, right? And so basically I want to get the value back of a couple of numbers. So let's say I call add with, some random number and then another random number. Get rid of that zero there, right? Right, so adding these two numbers, theoretically, like I said before, these two values would be replacing X and Y here. So returning X plus Y should give us a actual piece of data. Now, I'm gonna run this as is, despite the fact that there's a small little bug, just to prove the point, right? So here we have the function, we defined it, and here we're adding them, right? So we're gonna go ahead and just refresh the browser, take a look at the console, and clearly there's nothing that came back that said anything about the result of that addition, right? And that's because if we take a look here, right, well, what's going on? Well, we defined the function and we're calling the function, but we're never really looking at the result of the function, right? Because the result is the return x plus y. So because we're not really console.logging it, right? If I actually did like a console.log in here, right, and did x plus y, right? Now I'm adding to the function, but if I did this and I refresh and go ahead and look at the console, well, now I can see that there's that value. So clearly I'm going to need to console things that I want to see or things that I want to check, right? So console.log is going to be your best friend when it comes to debugging and utilizing JavaScript to do a lot more complicated things, right? I can't think of a single JavaScript program I've written that I haven't written at least one console log for. But instead of console logging here, right, I could do this and get that value there. But I can also say, well, because this is returning some data, I can get that data back as a variable. So I can say, let's sum and let it get equal to the result of that particular addition, right? So again, we're using the let keyword to create a variable called sum. That variable is going to get the result, right? What is returned from this addition that is taking place between these two numbers, right? So if I do that and then I console.log sum, right, we'll see that we actually get the same situation popping up where we got that data coming back. To make something cool, show you something cool that you can do with the console.log as well. We already saw a little bit earlier, right, that we can create long messages like this, but sometimes like you might just want to say, okay, like console log the value of this variable and then maybe like a little helpful message on the side, right? So I could say something like the sum is, and then put a comma and then put sum. And doing this, right, I actually will get a console log message that is similar, right? But I can put multiple values in as arguments to the console.log with a comma. And I like to write a lot of console logs like this sometimes when I'm debugging to get a sense of what's going on inside of my code. Clearly though, as y'all can see, right, writing functions, calling functions, and using functions to manipulate values of data is going to be increasingly important. And what gets tricky about JavaScript is not necessarily these things, because this is the fundamentals, right? Everything from learning about the different data types, right, to knowing about how we manipulate those data types and how we save them as variables, but then manipulate those variables in functions. That is essentially the fundamentals of JavaScript that we need to know in order to start doing a little bit more complex stuff. The last piece that I wanted to touch on related to kind of some of this introductory JavaScript stuff is two forms of data collections that we utilize all the time in JavaScript. And those are arrays and objects. And so we're going to be working with arrays, objects, and functions forever and ever and ever. That I can promise you, that we're going to continue to keep working on functions, arrays, and objects. But let's talk a little bit more about them so that we can get a sense as to how they all work, right? So, objects and arrays are two forms of data collections. We use them specifically for storing data, right? So in all of these examples so far, I've been utilizing one data item, one data piece, right? So person one is only really one only one piece of data, which is at this point a name, right? But if you think about the world and types of applications that we're building, we're not really dealing with like single pieces of data like that. We're dealing with a lot of data, right? If you think about an app like Facebook, right? It's not just enough to have just your name, right? They want your name, they want your age, they want your profile picture, they want the posts. Like if this is Instagram, you got videos, you got live stream, you got all of these things, right? And all of those pieces of data are important, right? So what data collections allow us to do is create opportunities for us to work with bigger bits of data and collections worth of data. Instead of single pieces of data, we can work with multiple pieces of data at once. So the two ways we can do that are with arrays and objects. And arrays are pretty fascinating because they allow for us to create a list of particular objects of data or particular data, I'll say, to not get us confused. But in this case, right, I could create an array and it'll just be a list of numbers for right now, right? And an array has a pretty interesting syntax. Here we're just giving that, setting that array to a variable. So this variable numbers now, numbers is an array that contains a couple different numbers, right? 1 through 5. Arrays are written with a square bracket syntax, so square brackets. And every piece of data within the array is just separated by a comma, right? What makes arrays unique, for those of y'all who aren't familiar with them, is that we can reference the values of an array using a syntax like so, where we give the name of the array and we also use square brackets to then say, hey, I want to take a look at a particular item within an array. Arrays all start at index 0. So I'll just put that in here. Index 0. Should put it down here so it's easy to see. So what that means is when we count the elements, we say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of their position within an array. I know that probably sounds real confusing, especially when you see this with numbers. So let's go ahead and just make another array. And let's say fruits or something, right? And in this array, I'll put an array of strings and I'll just say apple, peach, and grapes, right? So here's an array of strings, right? And so what I mean by arrays start at index 0 is that when we are trying to reference an item in an array, we have to reference it starting from index 0. So this would be 0 position, this would be 1, and then this would be 2. So if I want to get back the apple in this fruits array, right, I can do so by saying numbers, or not numbers, fruits at 0, right? So this syntax, fruits bracket, a number inside of the brackets, is me referencing an array element, right? So here I'm saying I want the first, and I'll say that the first array element, right? If I want the second array element, I do something like this, right? Referencing the second array. So we can reference these values. And what's cool about this is I can also then take these things, right, and put them in a console log and do something like this and say, okay, let me get back the first element of the array. And doing that, just refresh, and we can see in the console apple, right? Clearly, this is a simple example, but what's really cool about JavaScript arrays are that arrays in JavaScript are compact with very helpful functions and information that will make your life very easy when it comes to working with arrays. So I just put fruits dot to take a look at all the different functions that are put into here. And you can see, and we'll talk a lot about some of these array methods over time, but they're built into the JavaScript array, which is one of the things that people really love about working with JavaScript are some of the pre-built functions that are inside of it. The reason why we need some of those things is because when you start working with arrays, right, you tend to have to do things like loop a lot to get into all of the elements, right? And so in order for me to go ahead and take a look at all of these elements, right, I'm going to need to use a loop to do so, right? And so let's say I want to console log all of the fruits in this array. Well, you might have already seen something like a for loop like this, right? Where you say for index 0, right? I is less than something, I plus plus, and then we go ahead and do something like this, right? But this syntax is pretty, it's straightforward, but it also feels like a lot, right? Well, we don't have to use these for loops like this with arrays in JavaScript. If you're doing a loop, a typical loop, you might need to use a for loop. But one of the cool things about arrays in JavaScript are that they come built in with methods or functions that we can call that will allow for us to simplify the process of performing an action on every element of an array. So in this case, for each is a function that is a built-in function in arrays that will allow me to say, okay, the for each function itself takes in a function that you want to call whenever you, for every element that you see in an array. So in this, I can pass in a function that will be called with, that will be called for every element inside of an array. So what I mean by that is I can say, okay, well, let me define a function, some function that will, for every element inside of the fruits array, console log that element. So I'm going to write how I would do it, and it'll give us a great opportunity to talk about another way you can write functions in JavaScript. So to do that, I'm just going to create a new function, right? So I'm going to open some parentheses and just kind of just go with the flow real quick, and you guys will see an interesting looking syntax here, right? So what's very similar to the functions is that we have these curly braces, right? And I kind of entered so that we could get more space, but I'll get rid of the enter real quick so that we can just take a look at it as it was, right? So basically inside of these curly braces is my function, right? So I'm just gonna say my function. Well, this isn't gonna help me to do it this way. I'm gonna enter and then I'm just gonna leave a comment and say stuff goes here, right? But what we're looking at here is actually an interesting type of function. There's two ways to describe this function that we pass in here. The first thing that we got to know about this is that this is an example of what we call an arrow function, which is a more common way for us to write functions in JavaScript. So an arrow function gets its name because it is defined by this little arrow that basically says, hey, this is my function, right? So here is where you can pass some data to the function, but then stuff goes here, right? And the reason why arrow functions have been getting a little bit more popular is because they're quick and easy to write. You don't have to write the function keyword every time. It makes things a little bit easier to define, especially in cases like this, where it's like, I want to create a function on the fly to pass into this array method. The idea with an arrow function is that, like I said, data is put inside of these parentheses, excuse me, and the code goes in between the curly braces. So we wrote earlier a function for add, right? If I were to rewrite this function as an arrow function, it might look something like this. I would say let add equal or add. I'm going to say let add arrow just to give it, just so that we can know that they're different, right? Let add arrow, right? And this is still going to be a function to add values. And I'm just going to go ahead and write it as an arrow function, right? So here's my function with the function keyword. Here's my function with just arrow syntax. So clearly there's a couple differences in that with naming an arrow function, you kind of name it like a regular variable, right? Like, hey, like any other variable, I'm saying this is my variable is getting equal to something. And this is my arrow function. And this function, as you can see, is pretty much the same as this function up here, right? Except for the only thing that's different is there's this little arrow in between the parentheses and the curly brace. You can choose your type of way of writing functions, but it's important to know that both of these things would do the same. And to know that, especially with working with arrays, we might want to use, you might see, especially in examples online, people passing arrow functions instead of going out of their way to define a new function like this, right? But both are valid, and you know, you can choose which way to go. For the sake of how I work, and I'm going to try to show you as much of what is kind of the standard nowadays, and arrow functions are definitely very popular. With this arrow function, right, to finish up this function for the fruits, well, I want to say for every fruit, I want to console.log it. Well, the cool thing about array methods like for each, and there's a number of other array methods that do similar stuff where they take in a function like this. You pass in something that will reference some like name or ID name that you can use to reference every element inside of that array. So in this case, I'm just going to call it fruit, right? So basically what I'm saying is I'm giving this a variable name of fruit, but what the fruit will represent is every element inside of our fruits array that we see when the loop continues. So here, what I want to do is just console.log the fruit, if I can spell it, right? This name and could be anything. I could call it F, if I could type. I could call it F, I could call it item, right? I just gotta say, okay, if I call it something here, I know that what I'm referencing here is all of these elements that will be seen eventually in the loop, right? So I can call it whatever I want, but I chose to call it fruit just because I felt like it just makes more sense for an array called fruits to call each item a fruit, but it could be called whatever. But now with this loop and this array loop like this, we're able to then go back to our console and see all of our fruits are now being written out to the console, which is great. Great news for us. Arrays, there's a plethora of methods, and for each is one of those methods that you're gonna love to use because it just makes your life easier with working with arrays. Where if you think about it, typically when you did loops in any other scenario, you did typically do it with arrays, or you know, like it's not common to just do a loop for the sake of just doing a loop, but methods like for each make it so that you can do that loop in 2 lines versus a couple more. If I did want to finish writing out this for loop though for y'all and just kind of talking about it. So in this for loop that we're seeing here, is doing the same thing, right? So it's starting out creating a value to start at index 0 of the array, and it's going up to the array's length. And it's incrementing the index 1 time every time. Here, instead of calling this array.length, I'd have to pass what my array is actually called. So it would be called fruits. So basically what's going on in this line for fruits for each is all of this but you know, in the chat, I want you to tell me which looks nicer, the for each or the for loop, right? Like clearly the for each, right? It's like 2 lines, you know what I'm saying? Like, and very, very easy on the eye to read, right? So definitely we'll continue to make use of these array methods as we get deeper into our practice. The last piece I wanted to talk about, you know, now that we mentioned arrays, is objects, right? And objects are another type of data collection that's important to know how that we can use, because they give us the opportunity to, like I was mentioning earlier, do a little bit more nuanced work with different pieces of data. So what I want to do, I'll keep the arrow function stuff there. Actually move this up some. What I want to do is show you all some objects, right? And an object, simply put, is just a piece of data that allows you to define other multiple pieces of data inside of it. So if I was building an app like Facebook, I might have a user, right? And the user might have a name, right? And the name might be Cam. And that same user might have an ID, right? And the ID might be a random long piece of value there, right? That user might have some posts, right? And the post might be an array of posts, like a anybody here. I'm laughing at myself be alone. That's right. So and I might have something like email verified, right? True. Right. So here you can see in this one piece of data called user, I've used almost all of the data types that we talked about today, right? And that's what makes an object unique, is that you can define in the curly braces, right? The curly braces signifies an object, right? Anything in curly braces like this is an object in JavaScript. We call it an object. Objects have keys and values, right? The keys are referenced on the left side of a colon, and the values are referenced on the right side. Keys in JavaScript for an object are typically, we typically use strings to represent the key, but the value can be anything that you, any other data type that you typically would use. The value of using an object is that then you can reference those values similarly to like referencing the array. We can reference the object and we can reference any of the pieces of data inside of an object with this dot. So the dot says, hey, look inside of this object and take a look at any of the data that's defined in it. And I want you to, I want to use that piece of data, right? So here I can console log this user's ID by doing console log user.id, right? And that is going to say, take this user and get its ID, right? So when I go ahead, rerun this, right? There we go. Objects are great because you can store, like I said, multiple pieces of data inside of them, and they just make it easier for you to, hold on to all of these properties in one place, right? And now here's a fun fact, right? Like we saw earlier, we have this console.log, right? Well, what's interesting about this is, well, here's that dot syntax that I was just talking about right here for the user dot, right? Well, it turns out that the console is itself an object, and that object for a console comes with other functions. And in VS Code, anything with these purple little bricks things are functions. Or actually anything with the purple are functions that we can call, right? So clearly you can see console.log is just one function on the console that you can call, right? And we're not going to talk about all the other ones right now, but I'm using this to say, well, whenever we see this dot, it's because we're referencing something as if it's an object. Well, earlier I said arrays are defined like this, right? And so then why then would an array have also this dot and then have something like a method on it, like for each? Well, and this is what I'll end on for y'all lovely people. In JavaScript, all of these pieces of data, functions, arrays, etc., are treated as objects. Data in JavaScript are all treated as objects. They all kind of have object-like properties defining them, which is why you'll see that we use the dot syntax quite a bit with in a number of different contexts outside of just defining an object or a typical object ourselves. So you'll be working often with an object that has a function inside of it. So the way that console.log came about was because somebody wrote a log function on a log property in this object, and the log property had a function. So if I were to say something like this, console.log user name, or console.log, I'll just say can right now just to not make it complicated for us, right? this would then allow me to say, well, user, there's a property called log. So if I did something like user.log, right, I would hope then that when I rerun this, right, I get that cam coming back, right? So console.log is very much doing similar work as what we just defined here, right? Inside of the console, there is a function called log that's defined like so, where that function is doing the work. Clearly, we're not doing the internal work, but it's doing the work of making it so that we take what we wrote here and actually printing it to the console. And these, my friends, are really the fundamentals of JavaScript, especially for the context of working in the web with the types of stuff we're going to be doing, right? Every time you work on a site, you're going to end up using some variables. I'll go back to the top here. We're going to end up using some variables. We're going to end up using some functions. We're going to end up using arrays and objects and the different methods that come built into those two things for support. And we're going to be working with complex pieces of data that have in them a number of different pieces of data that we might need to work with in order to have our applications do what we hope that they can do. The value in knowing all of this is that now you know all the fundamentals of JavaScript, so that as we continue to expand on this, right, we'll be able to continue to use these very core concepts in order to get at our bigger goal of building more complex websites. So as a recap, right, we created this JavaScript by creating an HTML document, using the script tags to define a place for us to write some JavaScript. And inside of those script tags, we're able to write all of these different JavaScript programmatic things. The value of all of these programmatic things allows for us to do all types of things like manipulate data, create functions, and work with complex lists or objects worth of data. But this is just the beginning, and we've got a long way to go before we're ready to throw this into the loop. I encourage you to start writing some JavaScript yourself. And of course, as you poke around, you'll get ahead on some things. The way we wrote this JavaScript is a simple way to get started, but you'll find that there's even better ways, like taking this script and putting it in its own file, which is what we're going to get to next. But for now, this is our fundamentals of JavaScript. I appreciate y'all, and